The Oakmere Airport arrivals terminal was cold as metal. "Welcome home," my father said, his hug brief against the blur of faces and neon. Celine, my stepmother, smiled like a retouched photograph. 3 hours later, the garage door rolled shut, and her first punch landed. I didn't scream. I counted my breaths and began to plan in the one place where I was strongest: the office. My name is Marin Hale. I am 32 years old, and as of 96 hours ago, the newly appointed head of risk management for Stratus Ledger Systems. It's a family company. If you define family as a collection of individuals bound by shares and succession plans rather than affection, Oakmere isn't a city you visit. It's a place you either belong to or you don't. I had spent 14 years making sure I didn't. Yet, here I was, stepping back into the ecosystem I'd fought to escape, this time not as a daughter, but as a functionary with a mandate. The arrivals terminal at Oakmere International was a study in polished concrete and chilled, recycled air. It smelled faintly of floor cleaner and anxiety. My father, Graham Whitlock, the company's CEO, spotted me first. His smile was genuine but fleeting, the kind he reserved for closing a deal or a successful quarterly report. He moved through the crowd with an unconscious authority, his hand outstretched before he was close enough to make contact. The hug was brief, a pat-pat on the back that felt more like an endorsement than a welcome. The fabric of his suit was expensive Italian wool, thin and cool against my cheek. "Welcome home, Marin," he said, his voice a low baritone that carried easily over the din of rolling luggage and automated announcements. Standing a perfect, practiced half-step behind him was Celine, my stepmother, the chief financial officer of Stratus Ledger. Her smile was a masterpiece of corporate composure, a perfectly calibrated expression that conveyed warmth without reaching her eyes. They were the color of slate, and they were performing a rapid, effortless audit of my appearance. The sensible travel clothes, the lack of ostentatious jewelry, the single carry-on. She was immaculate, her blonde hair sculpted into a severe but elegant bob, her cream-colored trench coat unwrinkled despite the humidity. She didn't offer a hug. She extended a hand, her grip firm and dry. "It's good to have you back on the team," she said, her emphasis on team making it clear which relationship she prioritized. The ride from the airport was in my father's obsidian black sedan, a car so silent it felt like a vacuum-sealed chamber. The scent of expensive leather was oppressive. My father drove, his focus on the road a convenient shield from the tension coiling in the back seat. I sat opposite Celine, the space between us charged. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I read your preliminary proposal on the flight back from Zurich," she began, her voice crisp. "These enhanced internal oversight protocols you're suggesting, they seem rather extensive." I kept my gaze level. "They're standard for a company of our size and liability profile, especially with the new SEC guidance on data integrity. It's about proactive risk mitigation." "Proactive," she repeated, the word tasting like an accusation on her tongue. "Some might call it redundant. Our current systems have delivered record-low instances of reportable events for 3 consecutive years." "Your systems are excellent at reporting known events," I corrected, my tone carefully neutral. "My job is to identify the unknown ones, the ones that don't show up in a standard audit until it's too late." My father cleared his throat from the driver's seat. "Marin has a point. Celine, the board was very impressed with her Rivenport portfolio, a fresh set of eyes." Celine's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Of course, a fresh set of eyes is always illuminating." The conversation died there, leaving a ringing silence that lasted the final 10 miles home. The house was exactly as I remembered it, a monument of glass and steel overlooking the city, more corporate retreat than home. It was Celine's vision, a place designed to be photographed, not lived in. 3 hours later, I was in the garage. My father had retired to his study with a glass of scotch and a stack of board reports, his paternal duties for the evening fulfilled. I was retrieving my main suitcase from the trunk when the heavy garage door hummed shut, plunging the space into the stark, shadowless light of the overhead fluorescent tubes. Celine was standing by the interior door. She hadn't changed out of her trench coat. "I want to be perfectly clear," she said, her voice stripped of its boardroom polish. It was flat, cold steel. "You are here because Graham insisted, because the board likes the optics of a family succession. You are not here to dismantle my work." I closed the trunk and straightened up, facing her. "My work is to protect the company. That's the only agenda I have." "The company?" she scoffed, taking a step closer. The air grew thick. "You think this is about the company? I built the financial architecture of Stratus Ledger. I turned Graham's vague vision into a profitable, streamlined machine. I control every dollar that moves through its accounts. Which is why my role is essential," I said calmly. "Absolute control is a significant risk factor." That was the line. Her face, a moment before a mask of controlled fury, became something primitive. The slap was fast, the sound of it sharp and ugly in the concrete echo chamber. My head snapped to the side, my cheeks stinging with a heat that spread like wildfire. Before I could process it, she stepped in close, her body language that of a predator. She drove her elbow, hard, into my ribs. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. "Don't," she hissed, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of mint and malice. "Ruin what I've built. You will stick to your token projects. You will sign off on my reports, and you will stay out of my way. Do you understand me?" I didn't answer. I didn't move. My mind, which had momentarily stalled in shock, rebooted. The pain was a secondary input. The primary input was the threat. A threat to my position, a threat to my physical safety. My training took over. This was an incident, and an incident requires a report. I focused on my breathing, keeping it even despite the ache in my side. I met her gaze and held it, letting the silence stretch. I gave her nothing. No fear, no anger, no tears, just a blank, analytical stare. After a long moment, she seemed to realize she wasn't going to get the reaction she wanted. She straightened her coat, her features reassembling into the familiar mask of the CFO. "Unpack your things," she said, her voice once again cool and distant. "We have a breakfast meeting with the acquisitions team at 8. She turned and walked through the interior door, the lock clicking shut behind her. I stood alone in the garage, the hum of the freezer a low thrum in the silence. My cheek burned. My ribs felt like they were laced with broken glass, but my hands were steady. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my left wrist. My smartwatch screen glowed to life. With 2 precise taps, I navigated to the health suite. My heart rate was elevated, 118 beats per minute. Time, 22:47 PST. I swiped across and activated the hard fall impact detection feature's manual log. It prompted me with a question. "Did you experience an impact?" I tapped yes. The device saved a data packet, timestamp, heart rate variability, and a G-force estimate from the accelerometer. One piece of evidence. Next, my phone. I unlocked it, my fingers moving with practiced efficiency. I opened a specific app, one designed for legal documentation. It uses the phone's internal clock and GPS to create a verifiable, unalterable timestamp and location stamp on any photo. I angled the phone, using the car's reflective surface to see the screen, and took 3 high-resolution pictures of the rapidly forming red mark on my cheek. I then lifted my shirt just enough to photograph the angry purple bloom already forming over my ribs. The images were automatically tagged, 22:49 PST, 455 Skyline Drive, Oak Mere. I saved them to a triple encrypted folder in a secure cloud service, one completely separate from any Stratus Ledger account. 2 pieces of evidence. I walked into the house, up to my old room, and locked the door. I sat down at the minimalist desk, the same one I'd used in high school. I opened my personal email client and composed a new message. The recipient was myself. Subject: Incident Report. Personal Matter. 22:47 PST. October 14th. The body of the email was clinical, devoid of emotion. Incident time, approximately 22:47 PST. Location, residential garage, 455 Skyline Drive. Parties involved, Marin Hale, Celine Whitlock. Sequence of events. 22:46. Verbal confrontation initiated by C. Whitlock regarding my professional duties at Stratus Ledger Systems. 22:47. C. Whitlock issued a direct threat concerning my employment and actions within the company. 22:47. Physical assault initiated by C. Whitlock. Impact 1. Open-handed strike to the left side of the face. Impact 2. Elbow strike to the right rib cage. 22:48. C. Whitlock concluded the confrontation and exited the location. Immediate actions taken. Digital evidence of physical trauma secured at 22:49 PST. Smartwatch data logged. I hit send. The email landed in my inbox a second later. A time-stamped, third-party record of my account of the event. 3 pieces of evidence. I took out a small notebook and a pen. On the first clean page, I wrote, Begin, Phase 1. Documentation. Retaliation must be legal, procedural, and non-emotional. This wasn't about family drama. This was a hostile actor creating a compromising situation, and I would handle it the way I handled every other risk, with data, documentation, and an unbreakable chain of custody. My phone was in my hand again. I opened a browser and searched for the nearest urgent care clinic. I booked the first available appointment for the next morning, 7:30 a.m. A documented medical examination by a neutral third party would be the cornerstone of my file. 4 pieces of evidence. Finally, I opened my corporate calendar. I composed a meeting request to the head of human resources, copying the general counsel. Subject: Request for meeting. Potential workplace policy violation. I marked it as high importance. I didn't need to explain further in the invitation. The subject line was precise. This wasn't a family dispute I was bringing to the office. This was an executive-level employee, the CFO, physically assaulting another employee. A direct report in the corporate hierarchy, in a manner directly tied to their professional duties. It was a clear-cut violation of workplace safety and conduct policies. It was a massive liability. It was her first mistake. She had chosen the wrong battlefield. She thought this was a home. She thought she was hitting her husband's inconvenient daughter. She wasn't. She was assaulting the head of risk management, and I was already building the case against her. The headquarters of Stratus Ledger Systems occupies the top 12 floors of the tallest building in Oakmere, a gleaming monument to cloud computing and recurring revenue. Our business is trust, packaged as software. We provide cloud-based accounting and compliance solutions for entities that cannot afford mistakes. Hospital networks, multi-state pension funds, university endowments. The company's motto, emblazoned on brushed aluminum plates in the lobby and on the login screen of every terminal, is integrity, accuracy, trust. It was Celine who had commissioned that branding campaign. It was brilliant, associating our software with the bedrock principles our clients cherished. She had built herself in the same image, the steel CFO with a heart of gold. Her official corporate bio photo showed her smiling warmly, shaking hands with the director of a children's hospital, a major client. Her LinkedIn profile was a curated gallery of charity fund runs and keynote speeches at Women in Finance conferences. She was known for her tough but fair budget cuts and her compassionate employee assistance fund, which she personally oversaw. Celine had mastered the art of corporate performance, projecting an aura of unimpeachable integrity while running her division with the ruthless efficiency of a military commander. The office itself was a reflection of this philosophy. It was an open-plan landscape of glass walls, low-profile ergonomic chairs, and polished concrete floors. Natural light flooded the space, a design meant to convey transparency. But with no walls, there were also no secrets. Every conversation was semi-public, every meeting visible. The posters were everywhere, repeating the mantra: integrity, accuracy, trust. Looking at them now, the morning after the incident in the garage, the words felt like a cynical joke. I had left this world at 18, trading the suffocating privilege of Oakmere for a state school and, later, a grueling job as an independent auditor in Rivenport. Rivenport was a city of industry and grit, a place where balance sheets told stories of survival, not just growth. I learned to read those stories, to find the narrative hidden in the numbers. I was good at it. I built a career on professional skepticism and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Returning to Stratus Ledger wasn't a homecoming. It was a strategic compromise. My father had been trying to lure me back for years. When the previous head of risk retired, he'd made an offer I couldn't refuse, framing it as a chance to secure my own future and, implicitly, his legacy. I accepted not out of familial duty, but because access to Stratus Ledger's internal systems was a challenge I couldn't resist. It was the ultimate puzzle box. I had agreed to come back to protect the family business, but my definition of protection was likely very different from my father's. My father, Graham Whitlock, was the quintessential visionary CEO. He was brilliant at selling the big picture, at inspiring investors and employees with sweeping speeches about the future of fintech. He spoke passionately about core values and corporate responsibility, but he detested the granular details of execution. More importantly, he avoided conflict at all costs. To Graham, any direct confrontation, any internal friction, was an inefficient use of resources, a time cost that distracted from the larger goal of innovation. This aversion had allowed Celine to consolidate her power base. While he was giving TED Talks, she was rewriting the company's financial bylaws and installing her loyalists in key positions. The board adored her. In 3 years, she had increased profit margins by 22%, a feat she accomplished through aggressive vendor negotiations, strategic offshoring of non-essential services, and a system of financial controls so rigid it was legendary. She was the immovable object, the foundation upon which my father's ambitions were built. The whispers started before I even found my desk on the 28th floor. "That's Marin Hale, Whitlock's daughter. Heard she was a shark of an auditor out east." "Good luck to her. The CFO's department is a fortress. They call it the Iron Box. You don't question what goes on in the Iron Box." One analyst from the marketing team, a young man named Kevin who had been tasked with setting up my laptop, lowered his voice as we passed the silent, glass-encased finance department. "Just some friendly advice," he murmured, not making eye contact. "Log every request you send to them and get every approval in writing. They have a way of making careers stagnate." He said the last word as if it were a terminal diagnosis. My office was a glass box like all the others. Though slightly larger, befitting a department head, it had a commanding view of the city, a feature meant to inspire a sense of ownership and perspective. I ignored the view. After Kevin left, I closed the glass door, providing a thin illusion of privacy. My first act wasn't to arrange personal photos or adjust the chair height. It was to log into the system with the high-level credentials I'd been granted. My screen came to life, a dashboard of company vitals. I bypassed the summary reports and went straight to the administrative access panel. I pulled up the system-wide permissions log, a dense, unglamorous record of every user's access rights. Then, I cross-referenced it with the expenditure approval logs from the last 90 days. It was a dry, tedious task, but it was like learning the grammar of an organization. Who could see what? Who could sign off on payments? Where were the fast lanes and where were the toll booths? I spent 2 hours tracing the flow of data and money, my fingers flying across the keyboard, building a mental map of the digital plumbing that lay beneath the company's polished facade. It was in the middle of this deep dive that my desktop phone chimed. It was Celine's executive assistant. "Ms. Whitlock would be delighted if you would join her for a welcome lunch today, 12:30 at the Atrium." The Atrium was the sterile, high-end restaurant on the ground floor of the building, a place for power lunches and discreet deal-making. "Of course," I said. "I'll be there." Celine was already seated at a corner table when I arrived. She was sipping iced water from a tall, thin glass, a portfolio open in front of her. She looked up as I approached, her smile perfectly pleasant. There was no trace of the previous night's venom in her expression. The bruise on my ribs ached beneath my silk blouse, a dull, throbbing reminder of the reality behind the performance. "Marin, thank you for joining me," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "I know your first day must be a whirlwind." "It's manageable," I replied, my voice even. "I'm just getting a feel for the terrain." "Good. The terrain here can be unique," she said, closing the portfolio. Her eyes, cool and appraising, scanned my face. "I trust you slept well?" The question was a subtle jab, a test to see if I would flinch. I met her gaze without blinking. Like a log. The flight must have tired me out more than I thought. A waiter appeared, and we ordered salads. The small talk was excruciatingly corporate. She asked about my apartment search. I gave vague answers. She mentioned the upcoming quarterly review. I nodded and said I was looking forward to contributing. It was a chess match where every move was a polite, meaningless platitude. Then, as the waiter cleared our plates, she leaned forward slightly, her smile becoming a little more fixed. "You know, Marin, when your father told me you were coming back, I was thrilled, truly. But I do have one small concern." She paused, framing her next words carefully. "Your reputation in Rivenport precedes you. You're known for being incredibly thorough, rigid. Some might say, I hope you aren't planning on bringing that same inflexibility here. Stratus Ledger thrives on agility, on speed. Sometimes, you have to trust the systems and the people that are already in place." It was a beautifully constructed threat, wrapped in the language of friendly advice. "Don't dig too deep. Don't question my authority. Trust my systems." I took a slow sip of water, placing the glass down deliberately on its coaster. I gave her a small, professional smile. "I don't bring rigidity. Celine, I bring standards. They're not the same thing. My only goal is to ensure our agility doesn't become a liability. I'm sure you, of all people, can appreciate that." Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, the only crack in her composure. She had expected deference, perhaps a nervous assurance. She had not expected a calm, direct rebuttal that used her own logic against her. She recovered quickly, her smile returning, though it didn't quite reach her eyes this time. "Of course, standards are what we're all about," she signaled for the check. As the waiter processed the payment, she placed her hand on her portfolio, her polished red nails a stark contrast against the black leather. Her final words were delivered in a lower, more intimate tone, as if sharing a precious family secret. "Just remember, Marin, in this building, we are colleagues, but outside of it, we are family, and family always comes first, before the company, before everything else." It was a textbook manipulation tactic, framing a professional boundary as a personal betrayal. She was drawing a line in the sand, attempting to place me in an impossible position where challenging her at work would mean I was attacking the family. I simply nodded. "Thank you for lunch. Celine, it was very illuminating." As I walked back to the elevator, I pulled out my phone. I opened my notes app, the same one where I'd written my mission statement the night before. Beneath the line about legal, procedural retaliation, I typed a new entry. "Lunch with C.W. 13:15 PST. Attempted to leverage familial relationship to discourage professional oversight. Clear sign of manipulation. She's protecting something." The trap had been set. She thought she was reminding me of my place. What she had actually done was confirm my suspicions. The iron box had something to hide, and she had just handed me the key. The meeting with Brenda, the head of human resources, took place in a designated mediation suite on the HR floor. The room was designed to be calming, with soft gray walls, comfortable chairs, and a single, abstract painting of what looked like a blue cloud. It was a room engineered for de-escalation. Brenda herself was a woman in her late 50s with a PhD in organizational psychology and an air of professional empathy that seemed genuine until you noticed how her eyes constantly scanned for the nearest exit. She was a career HR professional, which meant she was an expert in corporate liability and risk mitigation. not necessarily injustice. I presented my case with the dispassion of an auditor reviewing a client's file. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use words like attack or assault. I used the term workplace violence incident. I laid out the sequence of events, referencing the timeline from the email I had sent myself. I then produced the medical report from urgent care. The doctor had documented a significant contusion on the right lower thoracic region, consistent with a focused, high-force impact, and superficial trauma to the left zygomatic arch. The report was clinical, factual, and damning. Finally, I showed her the time-stamped photos on my phone, holding it so the screen was visible to her but keeping the device firmly in my hand. Brenda listened intently, her pen making small, neat notes on a yellow legal pad. Her expression was one of carefully modulated concern. "This is deeply troubling, Marin," she said when I finished, "and I want to assure you that we take any allegation of this nature with the utmost seriousness, especially when it involves executive-level personnel." She used the corporate "we," a pronoun designed to distribute responsibility across an entire, faceless entity. "I trust the company's official policy on this is clear," I said, my tone flat. "Zero tolerance." "Absolutely," she confirmed, a little too quickly. "There is a formal process. I will open a case file immediately. It will be assigned a ticket number in our internal system, and it will be handled with the utmost discretion. For now, I would advise you to avoid any non-essential interaction with the other party involved. She's the CFO, Brenda, and my stepmother. Non-essential interaction is a luxury I don't have." "Of course, I understand. Let me initiate the process. You will receive an automated notification with the case number shortly. We will be in touch within 48 hours to discuss next steps." She stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. She gave me a tight, sympathetic smile. It was the smile of someone who was already calculating the potential fallout. For 2 days, I followed her advice. I went to my meetings. I analyzed data. I exchanged brief, professionally courteous emails with Celine about budget forecasts. I acted as if nothing had happened. The automated notification arrived as promised. Assigning my complaint, ticket 734B, I logged it in my personal notes. On the third morning, I logged into the HR portal from my desk to check the status of the ticket. I entered the number into the search field and hit enter. The system processed the request for a moment, and then a new page loaded. It was stark white, with a single line of text in the center. Case 734B, 404 not found. I stared at the screen. 404. Not a glitch, not a server error, which would have been a 500 series error. A 404 was a deliberate client-side error. It meant the server could be reached, but the specific file or page requested could not be located. It had been moved or, more likely, deleted. My stomach tightened. The cold, precise anger I had felt in the garage returned, sharper this time. This was a declaration of war. My first instinct was not to call HR. It was to go deeper into the system. My credentials as head of risk management gave me a level of administrative access that few people outside of IT possessed. I wasn't just a user, I was a system guardian. I opened the back-end administrative console, a place of raw data and command lines, far from the user-friendly graphic interface that most employees saw. I navigated to the server logs for the HR case management system. I searched for any activity related to ticket 734B. I found it, a log entry from the previous evening, at 23:17 PST. The entry was brief. User, B. Patel. Action, archive, set, flag, hidden, target, ticket 734B. The ticket hadn't been deleted. It had been hidden, flagged in a way that made it invisible to standard user queries, including my own. It was still in the system, but it effectively no longer existed. My next step was to investigate the user, B. Patel, Brenda Patel, head of HR. Why would she hide the very ticket she had promised to investigate? I cross-referenced her user activity log with the IT support ticket system, and there it was, a high-priority ticket submitted by Brenda's executive assistant 2 days prior. The subject: Urgent technical support required, case management system. The description was vague. Admin user requires assistance with file prioritization and archiving protocols. The most telling detail was who the ticket had been assigned to, not the general IT help desk, but a specialized unit within the IT department called the Executive Support Team. This was a small, elite group of technicians whose sole purpose was to provide white-glove service to the C-suite. Their budget, I knew from my initial review of the company's financials, was approved directly and personally by the CFO, by Celine. The chain of events was now sickeningly clear. I filed the complaint. Brenda, under pressure, opened the ticket. Celine was notified. She then used her authority to dispatch her personal IT squad under the guise of technical support to help Brenda make my complaint disappear. The official confirmation came an hour later, in the form of an email from Brenda. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. Subject: Following up on our conversation. Dear Marin, thank you again for your courage in bringing your concerns to my attention. After a preliminary review and in consideration of the unique familial context, we believe the most constructive path forward is not through the standard formal process, which can often be adversarial. Instead, we would like to facilitate a private, off-the-record family mediation session. We feel this approach is more aligned with the company's holistic values and will better serve the goal of a harmonious resolution. Please let me know when you might be available to discuss this alternative framework. Sincerely, Brenda Patel. It was breathtaking. She was unilaterally dismantling a corporate safety protocol and replacing it with a family chat. This was a direct violation of the company's own written policies, which explicitly stated that any complaint involving physical violence must trigger a formal, impartial investigation. Celine hadn't just punched me. She had punched a hole straight through the company's ethical framework, and HR was holding the door open for her. I didn't reply to the email. Instead, I went back to the audit logs. I had to know exactly how they had hidden the file. It took another hour of tracing digital footprints, but I found the specific command string. A technician from the executive support team had used a temporary system-level super admin privilege to access Brenda's account. This privilege, which was supposed to be used only for catastrophic system failures, allowed him to execute the hide command without leaving a direct trace on Brenda's normal user logs. It was a clean, professional hit, designed to be almost untraceable. Almost. He had forgotten to scrub the master server log. It was a rookie mistake, but one that people make when they think no one is watching. I took a series of encrypted screenshots of the logs, the initial ticket creation, the IT support request, the super admin access, and the hide command. My internal case was dead, but I was now building a new one, a case for conspiracy and obstruction. It was clear I couldn't trust any internal system. I logged into a secure, third-party compliance platform I had used in my auditing days. It was a service used by Fortune 500 companies to manage sensitive whistleblower reports and internal investigations. Completely firewalled from their own corporate networks, I paid for a personal account with my own credit card. There, I began to build a shadow case file. I uploaded the medical report, the time-stamped photos, the email I'd sent myself, the screenshots of the disappearing HR ticket, and the audit logs showing the IT intervention. I documented everything, creating a meticulous, unassailable record of the incident and the subsequent cover-up. The evidence was now off-site, beyond Celine's reach. My next move was to activate the company's ultimate failsafe. Buried deep within the corporate governance section of the Stratus Ledger Investor Relations website was the charter for the Board of Directors Audit Committee. And within that charter was a clause on whistleblower protection, mandated by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It provided a confidential, anonymous channel for reporting concerns about financial impropriety or obstruction of company policy directly to the independent members of the board. I followed the link to an encrypted web form. I wrote a brief, anonymous message. A formal complaint of a workplace violence incident involving a senior executive was filed with HR on October 15. The complaint was subsequently suppressed using IT resources controlled by the executive in question. This represents a serious breach of policy and a significant potential liability for the company. I have documentation. I submitted the form. I had just lit a very long fuse. The audit committee was composed of outside directors. They had a fiduciary duty to the shareholders, not to Celine. An allegation like this, even an anonymous one, would force them to act. With the pieces in motion to address the immediate threat, I turned my attention to the larger question. Why? Why would Celine risk so much over my appointment? The assault wasn't just about personal animosity, it was about control. She was terrified of me looking into her systems. My enhanced internal oversight protocols weren't just a threat to her authority. They were a threat to a secret she was keeping. I went back to the expenditure logs. The assault was the signal fire. The real crime, I suspected, was in the numbers. I began to run filters, searching for anomalies. I wasn't looking for a single, large fraudulent payment. That would be too clumsy, too easy to spot. I was looking for a pattern. I filtered for all vendor payments under $50,000, the threshold that required an additional layer of executive review. I looked for high-frequency payments to the same vendor for vague, ill-defined services. For hours, I saw nothing but the standard, boring transactions of a large corporation. Then, a name appeared, and then it appeared again and again. Peregrine North LLC. The invoices were all for strategic consulting services or market analysis reports. Each one was for a different amount, but always between $40,000 and $49,500. There were dozens of them over the past year. Peregrine North LLC wasn't a name I recognized from the approved vendor lists. It was a ghost. My heart began to beat a little faster. This was it. This was the thread. I ran one final query. I wrote a simple script to calculate the average time between invoice submission and payment approval for all vendors in this payment bracket. The average was 14 days. For some, it was as long as 45 days. For Peregrine North LLC, the average approval time was 7 minutes, and the name in the approved by column was always the same. C. Whitlock. Every single time. She wasn't just rubber stamping these invoices. She was expediting them with a speed that defied normal corporate procedure. She wasn't just hiding a punch. She was hiding a pipeline, and I was going to find out where it led. Peregrine North LLC was a digital ghost, but every ghost leaves a trace. The invoices themselves were Spartan, containing the bare minimum of information required for processing, but the files had to arrive somehow. They weren't being generated within our system. They were being submitted through the external vendor portal. My first step was to move beyond the financial data and into the communication logs. I initiated a targeted extraction of all email and file submission metadata associated with the vendor ID for Peregrine North. The process took several hours, the system churning through terabytes of archived communications. When the report was compiled, the pattern was immediate and chillingly specific. The invoices were not submitted during business hours. They weren't submitted late at night on a weekday. Every single one, without exception, was uploaded from an external IP address on a Sunday morning, at precisely 2:17 a.m. It was too consistent to be random. This wasn't someone working late. This was a scheduled task, an automated script, or a ritual. It was the digital signature of someone trying to conduct business in the dead of night, on a weekend, when system monitoring was at its lowest, and the chance of a live human analyst seeing the transaction in real time was practically zero. With the when established, I focused on the where, the money trail. My access level allowed me to view the raw transaction data from our corporate bank, a stream of ACH and IBAN codes that represented the lifeblood of the company. I isolated the outgoing payments to Peregrine North's account at a small regional bank in Delaware, a state notorious for its opaque corporate laws. The money would land in Peregrine's account, but it didn't stay there for long. I ran a trace on the outgoing transactions from that destination account. Within 24 hours of receiving payment from Stratus Ledger, a wire transfer for approximately 92% of the deposited amount was initiated from Peregrine's account. The destination was not another business. It was a private wealth management fund, which in turn funneled the money into a trust. The trust's name was Astor Hollow. The fee structure was a classic layering technique, designed to muddy the waters and make the money harder to trace with each step. But a trust must have a beneficiary. I requisitioned the trust's formation documents through a privileged data sharing agreement we had with the financial institution. The documents were heavily redacted, but one crucial piece of information was visible on the beneficiary designation form: the name of the primary recipient. It was listed simply as C.E. Witt. C.E. Witt? It was almost comically arrogant. Celine's middle name was Elizabeth. C.E. Whitlock. She hadn't even bothered to create a more sophisticated alias. She was confident, cocooned in the belief that no one would ever have the authority or the audacity to look this deep. The next step was to give a face to the ghost. Who was Peregrine North LLC? I bypassed our internal vendor vetting department, knowing their records would be either fabricated or compromised. Instead, I used a private investigative service I had contracted in my auditing days, paying the $500 fee from my personal account. The service specialized in public records and corporate due diligence. I submitted a request for the full incorporation documents for Peregrine North LLC, including the names of all registered agents and principals. The report came back in less than an hour. Peregrine North LLC was a shell company, registered at a mail drop address in Wilmington. It had no employees, no public-facing website, no physical presence. It existed only as a piece of paper, and the name of the sole incorporating officer, the individual who had signed the legal documents to bring the company into existence, was listed as Celine Rousseau. Rousseau. It took me less than 30 seconds with a public records search engine to confirm it. It was her maiden name. She had built a closed loop as Celine Rousseau. She created a company as Celine Whitlock. She approved its invoices. The money flowed from Stratus Ledger to Peregrine, then from Peregrine to a trust she controlled. She was submitting fraudulent invoices to herself and using her executive authority to approve them, all under a system of her own design that bypassed any meaningful review. I had the pattern, the mechanism, and the motive. Now I needed to prove it in action. I needed to create an experiment. I needed a honeypot. Working late into the night, long after the cleaning crews had emptied the trash cans and the building had settled into a deep silence, I began to construct my trap. I replicated a Peregrine North invoice perfectly, using an old one as a template. I used the same vendor ID, the same bank account information, and the same Spartan layout. I set the invoice amount at $48,750, comfortably under the $50,000 threshold. The line item was for Q3 Strategic Market Analysis. I typed the deliberate misspelling, analysis, myself. It was a small, subtle flaw, the kind a hurried human eye might miss, but the kind a detail-oriented reviewer, or even a basic spell-checking algorithm, should flag instantly. It was the digital equivalent of a marked bill. Then, I prepared the delivery. I couldn't submit it through the vendor portal myself, as that would link the submission to my own credentials. Instead, I used a remote access tool to log into a neutral, low-level procurement terminal on the other side of the country, routing my connection through a series of VPNs to mask my own IP address. The final exit node was a public server in Chicago. From this anonymized position, I uploaded the invoice. Before I hit submit, I started a screen recording application. The software captured my entire desktop, and I enabled the feature that burned a running second-by-second timestamp directly into the video file. I started the recording. I dragged the fabricated invoice into the submission window. I clicked the button. The system accepted the file, and a small notification appeared. Invoice submitted for review. I didn't touch the computer. I simply sat and watched the clock in the corner of the screen. 1 minute passed, 2. At the 4-minute mark, the status changed to processing. At the 7-minute mark, it changed again. Approved for payment. 7 minutes, from submission to approval, for an invoice from a shell company, for a 6-figure sum. With a spelling mistake in the only line item, there was no human review, there was no due diligence, there was only an automated rule, a silent, efficient piece of code that said, if vendor equals Peregrine North in amount, $50K, then approve. It was Celine's private highway, bypassing all the toll booths and checkpoints that every other vendor had to navigate. I stopped the screen recording. The resulting MP4 file was a perfect, time-stamped, irrefutable piece of evidence showing the system's fatal flaw in action. I uploaded it to my shadow case file. My work for the night wasn't done. The existence of this automated approval rule implied a failure in the initial vendor setup. I accessed the document repository for the procurement department and located the master vendor agreement file for Peregrine North LLC. I placed it side by side with the standard template contract that was supposed to be used for all new consulting vendors. I compared them, line by line. On page 12 of the standard template, section 8.4 was the right to audit clause. It was a boilerplate but critical piece of legal text that gave Stratus Ledger the explicit right to audit the vendor's financial records related to any services provided. In Peregrine North's contract, section 8.4 was still there, but the text was different. It was a bland, meaningless statement about cooperation with routine inquiries. The legally binding right to a full audit had been surgically removed. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate move to make the company legally toothless should anyone ever get suspicious. One final piece was needed to lock the case down. I needed independent verification. I couldn't risk using our current internal or external auditors, as they all ultimately reported to the CFO's office. I needed someone I could trust, someone with unimpeachable credentials and no loyalty to Celine. I called Mark Renshaw. Mark had been my mentor at the audit firm in Rivenport, a man whose professional skepticism was legendary. I didn't tell him the whole story. I didn't need to. I explained that as part of my new role. I was conducting a review of certain vendor payment controls and needed a third party to perform a limited, confidential, agreed-upon procedure. It was a specific type of engagement where an auditor is hired to perform only the steps they are asked to and report the factual findings. Without offering an opinion or conclusion, I asked him to independently verify 2 things. First, that a series of payments to a specific vendor, which I identified only by its ID number, consistently bypassed the standard 14-day review cycle. And second, to perform a source IP trace on the original invoice submission files. 2 days later, his report arrived in an encrypted email. The factual findings were stark. He confirmed the accelerated payment schedule, noting it was an anomaly compared to 99.8% of other vendors in the same category. And then came the final nail. He had traced the source IP addresses for the last 6 invoices submitted by Peregrine North. They were not from a corporate office in Delaware. All 6 submissions originated from the same public IP address. It was registered to a small, independent coffee shop, a place called the Daily Grind in Oakmere Heights. I ran the address. It was 3 blocks from my father's house, 3 blocks from where Celine laid her head to sleep every night. The snare was built, the bait had been taken, and the digital fingerprints led directly to her doorstep. All that remained was to choose the moment to pull it tight. Celine's offensive shifted from the physical to the psychological. It began a week after the incident, in the sterile quiet of the 28th floor pantry. I was making tea, my back to the door. I didn't hear her approach until she was right behind me. Her presence a sudden drop in the room's temperature. Her hand came to rest on my shoulder. Then her fingers moved to my hair, a slow, possessive stroke. The gesture was meant to look maternal to anyone who might glance in, but it felt like a spiderweb. "Marin," she whispered, her voice a soft poison meant only for me. "I know you're under a lot of pressure, settling in, but you can't let it affect your judgment. We are a family. Don't break our family over a misunderstanding." I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the hot water swirling in my mug. I recognized the tactic instantly. Reframe the assault as a misunderstanding, position me as the aggressor, breaking the family, and establish a narrative of my emotional instability, under a lot of pressure. It was a classic manipulator's trifecta. "There is no misunderstanding. Celine," I said, my voice low and steady. I stepped away from her touch, creating space. "There is only a sequence of events. The data is quite clear." I walked out without looking at her, but her campaign had just begun. Over the next few days, the social climate around me began to change. Conversations would halt when I approached the coffee machine. Colleagues who had been friendly and curious now offered tight, fleeting smiles and averted their gaze. Kevin, the helpful marketing analyst, now seemed to find the floor tiles fascinating whenever I passed his desk. Celine was poisoning the well, not with loud accusations, but with quiet, concerned whispers. I could almost hear the words she was planting in the corporate soil. "Marin is so intense. She seems agitated. I'm worried she's not coping well with the move back. She just seems so unstable. Maybe she needs a break." She was building a portrait of me as a victim, but the wrong kind. Not a victim of violence, but of my own fragile psyche. She was creating a pretext. The pretext was cashed in on a Friday afternoon. An email from Brenda Patel landed in my inbox. Subject: Supportive realignment of duties. Dear Marin, in light of your recent transition and our ongoing commitment to employee well-being, we in HR have been considering ways to better support your integration into the Stratus Ledger team. We feel that a temporary realignment of your duties may be beneficial, allowing you to focus on core strategic objectives without the added pressure of day-to-day data oversight. Effective Monday. Your access credentials will be updated to reflect this supportive shift. We will be temporarily assigning the routine vendor and expenditure log analysis to the junior risk team. This will free you up to focus on the high-level policy white papers we are all so eager to see. We trust you'll agree this is a positive step for your work-life balance. Sincerely, Brenda Patel. It was a corporate assassination, executed with a smiling emoji. They weren't firing me. They were neutering me. They were taking away the keys. Without access to the raw data streams, the vendor logs, the expenditure approvals, the email metadata, I was blind. I was a head of risk management who wasn't allowed to manage risk. I was being sidelined, placed in a gilded cage to write useless white papers while the looting continued. This was Celine's checkmate. I read the email twice. I then clicked reply. Dear Brenda, thank you for your proactive support. I appreciate the company's focus on well-being and welcome the opportunity to dedicate more time to high-level strategy. Best. Marin. I hit send. Then, I smiled. A genuine, cold smile of satisfaction. I opened my desk drawer and took out a small, unlabeled access card. I stood up, walked to my office's supply closet, and retrieved a laptop bag that had been sitting there since my second day. Inside was a slim, powerful laptop, not issued by Stratus Ledger, which I had purchased myself. On my first night, after documenting the assault, I had anticipated this exact move. I knew Celine's goal would be to cut off my access. So, before my official credentials had been fully provisioned, I had used a temporary high-level IT setup token, a privilege granted to new executives for 24 hours to configure their systems, to authorize a secure encrypted API data stream to an off-site, private cloud server that I controlled. It was a gray area of the IT policy, but not a direct violation. Every night since, that server had been creating a complete, time-stamped mirror of the company's financial and communication logs. They were revoking my access to the live system. They didn't know I had a copy of everything, updated daily. I left my Stratus Ledger laptop on the docking station. I packed my personal belongings and walked out of the office with the backup machine. On Monday, I would return, smile, and start writing the most innocuous white paper on risk theory they had ever seen, all while continuing my real investigation from a machine they couldn't monitor, using data they didn't know I had. My next step was to diffuse the unstable narrative. Celine had made my mental state a potential issue, so I would make it a documented asset. I booked an appointment with a highly regarded psychotherapist in the city, Dr. Alani. I went not because I felt I was breaking, but because I needed an expert witness to my sanity. In her quiet, tastefully decorated office, I recounted the events. I was factual and calm. I described the assault, the corporate cover-up, and the psychological campaign being waged against me. "I'm not here because I feel overwhelmed or unable to cope," I stated clearly. "I am here because a calculated effort is being made to portray me as mentally unstable in a high-stakes corporate environment. I require a professional, objective record of my cognitive and emotional state during this period. I am treating this as a necessary step in risk mitigation." "Doctor," Alani listened, her expression unreadable. She took notes. At the end of our session, she said, "It seems you have a very clear and rational assessment of your situation. Ms. Hale, you are processing these events not as a victim, but as a strategist." It was exactly the kind of professional assessment I needed on the record. I booked a recurring weekly appointment. My tactics had to change. Direct confrontation was useless. The system was rigged against me. From now on, I would go silent. I would be the model employee they wanted me to be. Quiet, compliant, and focused on my light duties. I would stop probing, stop asking questions, and give Celine the illusion that she had won, that I had been successfully declawed. All my work would now happen in the dark, sifting through the mirrored data on my private machine, adding to the chain of evidence piece by piece, building a case so airtight that when I finally presented it, it would be undeniable. There was one last variable I needed to resolve. My father. I had to know, definitively, where he stood. Was he a pawn, a willing co-conspirator, or just a coward? I invited him for coffee, away from the office and the house, at a neutral cafe downtown. He seemed relieved by the invitation, as if it were a sign of normalization. We sat by the window, the city bustling around us. After a few minutes of strained small talk, I pivoted. I didn't mention Celine or the assault. I approached it from his language, the language of the CEO. "I've been reviewing some of our vendor protocols," I began, my tone professional. "And I've noticed some potential risk exposure in our automated payment systems, particularly for high-frequency consulting vendors. Some of the controls seem a bit porous." His eyes immediately drifted away from mine, out the window to the traffic beyond. It was a classic tell. His face tightened. "That's Celine's domain. Marin," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Her financial controls are the tightest in the industry. The board considers them the gold standard. She has it all handled." "With all due respect," I pressed gently, "the gold standard requires independent verification. That's my job. I'm seeing patterns that warrant a closer look. It's a potential liability." He took a long sip of his coffee, still not looking at me. "The greatest liability is internal friction," he said, the words sounding rehearsed, like a line from one of his speeches. "Celine has delivered record profits for 3 years straight. We cannot afford to disrupt her systems, to create conflict where there is none. Let it go. Focus on your white papers. That's where you can add the most value right now." And there it was. It wasn't malice. It was a calculated business decision. He was trapped, not by Celine's threats, but by her success. He had built his reputation as a visionary on the foundation of the profits she generated. To question her was to question his own success, to risk the stability and peace he valued above all else. He wasn't her partner. He was her beneficiary, and he was too deep in to pull out. He would not help me. He couldn't. I felt a quiet, hollow sense of finality, not sadness, but clarity. The final door had closed. I was completely on my own. "I understand," I said, and I did. I understood perfectly. That night, I went back to my apartment and finalized my report. It was no longer just an anonymous tip. It was a full-blown risk assessment dossier. I wrote a crisp, 3-page executive summary detailing the suppressed workplace violence complaint, the evidence of a systematic financial control breach, the existence of a shell company vendor, and the clear conflict of interest of the CFO. I cited the specific corporate bylaws and SEC regulations that were being violated. The tone was not accusatory, it was factual. The cold, hard language of risk. I attached the appendices, each one a digital exhibit in my silent trial. Appendix A, the medical report. Appendix B, time-stamped photos of the injuries. Appendix C, the complete audit trail of HR ticket 734B's creation and suppression. Appendix D, the screen recording of the honeypot invoice being approved in 7 minutes. Appendix E, Mark Renshaw's independent report confirming the payment anomaly and the coffee shop IP address. Appendix F, the side-by-side comparison of the standard vendor contract and Peregrine North's version with the missing right to audit clause. I encrypted the entire package. I addressed it to the personal email addresses of the 3 independent directors who sat on the audit committee, bypassing all corporate channels. I hit send. The following morning, a company-wide calendar invitation appeared. The subject? Mandatory quarterly business review. It was scheduled for 2 weeks' time, in the main boardroom on the 28th floor. The stage was set. The invitations had been sent. The audience would be assembled. Celine thought she was writing a story about my instability. She had no idea she was the main character in a tragedy of her own making, and I had just submitted the final script. The 7-minute approval wasn't a fluke. It was a feature. My honeypot invoice had proven its existence, but I needed to find the mechanism itself, the lines of code that gave Peregrine North its privileged status. While my official duties had been curtailed, my mirrored data was a perfect sandbox. I spent 2 nights sifting through the back-end scripts of the accounts payable system, the digital architecture that Celine had so proudly built. I was looking for a specific kind of command, a conditional logic statement, an if-then rule that operated outside the standard workflow. I found it buried in a legacy subroutine that had been modified a year ago. It was an elegant, simple, and deeply corrupt piece of programming. The rule was even named, with a breathtaking arrogance, Fast Track Exec. It was a deterministic algorithm. If the vendor ID matched Peregrine North LLC's, and if the invoice total was less than $4,900, the system was programmed to bypass the multi-stage human review process and grant immediate automated approval. It was designed to exploit a known loophole. Invoices under $50,000 were not subject to the mandatory secondary audit that larger sums triggered. By keeping each transaction just under the wire, Celine could siphon funds in a steady stream, each individual transaction too small to raise a red flag, but cumulatively representing a massive hemorrhage of company funds. With the rule identified, I could now visualize the entire scheme. I wrote a script to pull every payment made to Peregrine North over the preceding 90 days and plot them on a simple timeline graph. The result was a perfect sawtooth pattern. The line would climb as invoices were submitted, then drop sharply as they were paid, never once breaching the $49,500 ceiling. It was the financial heartbeat of a crime, a visual representation of systematic fraud. In the last fiscal quarter alone, there had been 58 separate transactions, 58 bites out of the apple, each one carefully measured. The digital evidence was compelling, but I wanted to tie it inextricably to Celine as a person, not just as a user profile. I took the server logs from Mark Renshaw's report, the ones containing the IP address of the Daily Grind coffee shop, and I cross-referenced the timestamps of the invoice submissions with Celine's official corporate calendar, which I still had access to in my mirrored data. The results were staggering. Of the 58 invoices submitted in the last 90 days, 50 of them had been uploaded during periods when Celine's calendar had her marked as personal appointment. Working remotely, or during early weekend mornings, the correlation between her physical schedule and the digital submissions was 87%. It was a statistical near certainty. She was sitting in that coffee shop, 3 blocks from her home, personally uploading the fraudulent invoices before driving to the office to play the part of the Steel CFO. It was time to move out of the shadows. I had enough to force the company to protect the evidence. I drafted a formal request to the General Counsel. David Chen, a man known for his cautious, by-the-book demeanor. The request was for a legal data hold, also known as a litigation hold. It's a formal directive to preserve all data, emails, logs, documents, and transaction records related to a specific subject, overriding all standard data deletion or overwriting protocols. To fail to preserve data after a hold is issued is an act of spoliation, a serious offense with severe legal consequences. I didn't mention fraud. I framed it within my official, albeit diminished, capacity. My memo was brief and professional. To David Chen, General Counsel. From Marin Hale, Head of Risk Management. Subject: Urgent. Data Preservation Directive for Vendor ID 77A9P. Peregrine North, LLC. Pursuant to my duties in assessing systemic risk, I have identified irregularities in the payment protocols and contract fulfillment associated with vendor Peregrine North, LLC. To ensure a complete and accurate audit trail is available for my upcoming risk assessment report, I am formally requesting an immediate and comprehensive data hold on all records related to this vendor, effective immediately. I sent the email. It was a shot across the bow. David, as General Counsel, had a fiduciary duty to the company that superseded any loyalty to an individual executive. He could not legally ignore such a request from a department head, especially one with risk in her title. Within an hour, he replied with a single word: acknowledged. The trap was now locked. Any attempt by Celine or her IT cronies to delete or alter the Peregrine files would now be a federal crime. Celine's reaction came 48 hours later. It was not a direct confrontation. It was a company-wide email, sent from her office to every single employee of Stratus Ledger. Subject: a message from the CFO, accelerating for the future. Team. In today's fast-paced market, agility is everything. I want to empower all of you to move faster and think bigger. That means cutting through red tape and eliminating bureaucratic bottlenecks that slow us down. Let's prioritize speed and trust in our systems and in each other. Let's spend less time on redundant checks and more time innovating for our clients. Onward and upward. Celine Whitlock. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda. To the average employee, it was an inspiring corporate pep talk. To me, it was a direct public rebuke of my data hold. She was framing my legally necessary act of preservation as red tape and bureaucratic bottlenecks. She was preemptively painting anyone who advocated for controls and oversight as an enemy of progress. I did not engage her in a public email war. I responded with a quiet, targeted memo, sent only to the other C-suite executives, the board, and David Chen. The subject line was, "Clarification on SOX compliance regarding internal controls." I quoted, verbatim, the section of our own internal policy that was written to ensure compliance with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the federal law passed to prevent accounting fraud. The section I quoted stated, "All financial controls, including automated approval systems, must be subject to periodic, independent review to ensure their integrity. Bypassing such controls for the sake of speed may constitute a material weakness and expose the company and its signing officers to significant legal and financial penalties." I added no commentary. I simply attached the text. The message was clear. This isn't about speed versus bureaucracy. This is about compliance versus federal crime. I was letting them know that Celine's public posturing had strayed into dangerous territory. The memo had an unintended consequence. That evening, I received a message on a secure encrypted messaging app I had installed on my personal phone. It was from a name I recognized, Michael Garrett, a senior manager in the Accounts Payable Department. M. Garrett. Is there a secure way to talk? It's about vendor approvals. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sent him a secure link. A few minutes later, another message came in. This time from another manager in the same department, a woman named Sarah Jenkins. She had gotten my contact from Michael. They were scared, and they were corroborating each other's stories. I met them separately, late at night, in a quiet park miles from the office. Their stories were identical. For the past year, they had been under immense pressure from Celine's office to fast-track approvals for a specific list of vendors, with Peregrine North always at the top. When they had raised questions about the lack of supporting documentation, they were told it was a special strategic project and that delaying payment would have career-limiting consequences. They had been intimidated into compliance. They were good people caught in a bad system, and my memo about SOX compliance had both terrified them and given them a sliver of hope. I explained the whistleblower protection clause that covered them. I walked them through the process of writing a formal statement. By the end of the week, I had 2 signed, notarized affidavits detailing the pressure campaign from the CFO's office. I didn't keep them myself. I sealed them in an envelope and delivered them directly to the General Counsel's office, to be placed in his private safe. The digital case was now supported by human testimony. The quarterly business review was the perfect stage. It was the one meeting where the entire executive team, the board's audit committee, and key department heads would all be in the same room. I spent the final week preparing not a presentation, but a demonstration, a live demo. My goal was not to accuse, but to let the system expose itself. I built a simple, clean interface that would run on the boardroom's main screen. It would show the sawtooth graph. It would show the map with the coffee shop's location. It would show the side-by-side contract comparison. But the finale was the most important part. I embedded a function into the presentation that, with a single keystroke, would initiate a real-time action within our live corporate network. The key to the entire thing was a process that Celine herself had championed for the sake of security. 2-factor authentication. To perform certain high-level functions, like resetting a vendor password, the system required a one-time code sent via SMS to the registered phone number of the account's primary contact. The primary contact for Peregrine North LLC, according to the vendor file, was one Celine Rousseau, and the phone number registered to that account was not some anonymous burner phone. It was the same number that Celine Whitlock used every day. My plan was simple. I wouldn't need to shout. I wouldn't need to point a finger. In the middle of that silent, stunned boardroom, I would let the truth announce itself with a simple, undeniable notification on the screen of the phone sitting on the table right in front of her. The trap was no longer just digital. It was about to become very, very real. The boardroom on the 28th floor was not a room. It was a panorama. 3 walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a silent, sweeping view of Oakmere under a cool, unforgiving morning light. The 4th wall was a seamless black LED screen, currently displaying the Stratus Ledger logo against a backdrop of gently moving clouds. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror finish, reflected the screen and the tense, composed faces of the dozen people seated around it. This was the stage. The members of the audit committee, 3 independent directors with impassive, weathered faces, sat together like a panel of judges. David Thorne, the general counsel, was next to them, his posture rigid, a leather-bound portfolio closed neatly before him. Brenda from HR was present as well, looking pale, her professional empathy mask firmly in place. My father, Graham Whitlock, sat at one head of the table, the picture of the confident CEO, and at the other head, directly opposite him, sat Celine. She wore a severe charcoal gray suit, a splash of crimson lipstick her only concession to color. Her phone was placed face down on the table beside her portfolio, a small, black slab of dormant technology. She was the queen in her court, radiating an unshakable, icy authority. I was seated along the side, a deliberate choice to appear as a supporting player, not a protagonist. My father began the meeting, his rich baritone filling the room. He spoke of the future, of innovation, of the need to move at the speed of thought. His keynote was a well-rehearsed ode to agility and empowerment. Our greatest asset, he concluded, his eyes sweeping across the assembled faces, is not our software, nor our infrastructure. It is trust, the trust our clients place in us, and the trust we must have in each other to move forward, unburdened by hesitation. The irony was so thick it felt like I could taste it, metallic and bitter on my tongue. As he finished, a polite smattering of applause echoed briefly. The agenda moved to departmental updates. When it was the risk department's turn, I cleared my throat. All eyes turned to me. "Before I present the standard quarterly summary," I said, my voice calm and measured, "I have a brief, 12-minute risk spotlight I need to present. The topic is vendor payment fragmentation and associated control deficiencies." A flicker of annoyance crossed Celine's face. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and dismissive. "We have a packed agenda. Marin, can this not be summarized in your written report?" I met her gaze across the long table. The entire room was watching this small, sharp exchange. "The findings are time-sensitive and have material implications that require the audit committee's immediate attention," I said, my tone unyielding. 12 minutes is all I'll need. Celine." My use of her first name, a small breach of boardroom protocol, hung in the air. One of the audit committee members, a stern-faced man named Robertson, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Let's hear it," he said. Celine leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She had been overruled. She acquiesced with a curt wave of her hand. "Proceed." I stood and walked to the head of the table. I took out a standard USB drive from my pocket and inserted it into the port on the lectern. The click of its seating was the only sound in the room. It was a decoy. The presentation I was about to launch was not on the drive. As I had arranged with the General Counsel, it was being run from a sandboxed, temporary server controlled by the IT Security Division, a legally sanctioned and monitored environment. This was not a personal project. This was a formal risk presentation. I clicked the mouse, and the Stratus Ledger logo on the giant screen dissolved. It was replaced by the sawtooth graph. "For the past year," I began, my voice amplified slightly by the room's microphone system, "we have seen a significant anomaly in the payment schedule of a single consulting vendor, Peregrine North, LLC. I explained the $4,900 threshold and how 58 separate payments in the last quarter alone had perfectly exploited it. The jagged, unnatural line on the screen looked like a failing heart monitor. I clicked again. The graph was replaced by a map of Oakmere, a single, pulsing red dot marking the location of the Daily Grind coffee shop. Our analysis, confirmed by an independent third party, has traced the IP address of every single one of these invoice submissions to this single public location." Another click, a simple, clean flowchart appeared, a box labeled Stratus Ledger Systems on the left, an arrow pointing to a box labeled Peregrine North, LLC, another arrow from that to a box labeled Astor Hollow Trust, and in that final box, a single line of text, Beneficiary C. E. Witt. A low murmur rippled through the room. My father stared at the screen, his face slack with confusion. Celine remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable, a mask of carved ice. "The documentation for this vendor is irregular," I continued. "The right to audit clause was removed from its contract, and its payments are subject to an automated approval rule that bypasses all standard human oversight." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "I believe this constitutes a material weakness in our internal financial controls." Then, I delivered the next blow. "Furthermore, the pressure to process these payments has been significant. David," I said, looking at the General Counsel, "could you please ask Mr. Garrett and Ms. Jenkins to join us?" David Thorne nodded and spoke into the conference phone. "Please send them in." The boardroom door opened, and Michael Garrett and Sarah Jenkins walked in. They looked terrified, but resolute. They stood by the door, and I addressed them directly. "Michael, could you please confirm for the committee if you or your team have ever been instructed by the CFO's office to expedite payments for Peregrine North?" Michael swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on me. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "We were told they were priority payments for a special project and that any delays would have career-limiting consequences. Sarah Jenkins nodded in confirmation. "Thank you," I said. "That will be all." They turned and exited as silently as they had entered, the door clicking shut behind them. The silence they left in their wake was heavy, and into that silence, Celine's voice sliced like a shard of glass. "This is an outrage," she snapped, her voice trembling with manufactured fury. She shot to her feet, her hands flat on the table. "This is a baseless, vindictive fantasy woven from disconnected data points by a disgruntled employee. It's conjecture. It's slander." I did not respond to her outburst. I did not look at her. I looked at the screen, at the flowchart that still displayed her initials. "You're right," I said calmly. "It is just data. It requires verification. Let's verify it." My hand was on the mouse. With all eyes on me, I moved the cursor to a small hyperlink at the bottom of the screen. The text simply read, "Initiate vendor password reset." "The contact of record for Peregrine North is a Celine Rousseau," I explained to the room. "As a security measure, our system requires two-factor authentication to reset a vendor password. If I click this, it will send a one-time 6-digit verification code to the phone number registered to the account." I looked up from the screen and directly at her. "Let's see whose phone receives the code." Celine's face went white. A flicker of pure, animal panic flashed in her eyes. "Don't," she breathed, the word barely audible. I pressed the enter key on the keyboard. On the massive screen, a simple dialog box appeared. It read, "Password reset initiated for Peregrine North, LLC. To verify your identity, please enter the 6-digit code sent to the registered mobile device ending in 4478. For a full 3 seconds, there was absolute silence, and then a sound, a low, insistent, electronic buzz. It was the sound of a phone, set to vibrate, rattling against the polished mahogany of the boardroom table. Every head in the room turned, not to the screen, not to me. They all turned towards the source of the sound, towards the small black phone lying face down on the table, directly in front of a frozen Celine Whitlock. The hum of the HVAC system, a moment ago unnoticed, was now a roaring silence. The air in the room seemed to thin, sucked into a perfect, cold vacuum. The buzzing seemed to last an eternity. It was a low, angry sound in the cathedral-like silence of the boardroom. No one breathed. Every person in the room was a statue, their gaze locked on the small, vibrating rectangle of black glass in front of the CFO. Celine herself was frozen, her face a mask of disbelief, her hand hovering just above the device as if it were a venomous snake. The vibration stopped, leaving a ringing void. Slowly, as if moving underwater, her hand descended, her fingers, trembling almost imperceptibly, closed around the phone. She flipped it over. The screen flared to life, its cold blue light illuminating the sudden, stark terror in her eyes. The notification was displayed in a clean sans serif font across the top of her screen. The words were perfectly legible from halfway down the table. "Peregrine North. Your verification code is 819274. A collective, sharp intake of breath was the only response. The digital world and the physical world had just collided with the force of a thunderclap, right there on the polished surface of the mahogany table. Before she could react, before she could form a single word of denial, I clicked the mouse again. The password reset dialog box on the main screen vanished. It was replaced by a high-resolution scan of a legal document, the Articles of Incorporation for Peregrine North, LLC. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom. "The signature on this document," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence, "is digital. It was executed using a cryptographic key. Every senior executive at Stratus Ledger is issued a unique, high-security digital certificate for signing off on sensitive documents. It is our unforgeable fingerprint." I clicked again. A second document appeared side by side with the first. It was the quarterly financial report Celine had submitted to the SEC 2 months ago. I zoomed in on her signature. I ran a comparison of the cryptographic certificate used to sign Peregrine North's incorporation papers against the one used to sign our official SEC filings. A green box appeared on the screen, highlighting both signatures. A line of text materialized between them. Certificate hash, match confirmed. The key that created the shell company, I stated, letting the words land with the weight of a judge's gavel, is the exact same key that belongs, exclusively, to our chief financial officer, Celine Whitlock. That's what broke her composure. No! The word was a strangled cry. She shot back from the table, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She snatched the phone, clutching it to her chest like a shield. This is a setup. Someone is framing me. My credentials must have been stolen. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, finding only a gallery of stony, accusing faces. Marin did this. She's been trying to undermine me since the day she arrived. Her accusation hung in the air, a wild, desperate gambit. I didn't answer it. I simply pressed the spacebar on the keyboard. The documents on the screen were replaced by the video file I had created. The boardroom was plunged into the perspective of my screen recording. They saw the fabricated invoice for strategic market analysis. They saw it being uploaded. They saw the timestamp in the corner of the screen, ticking away the seconds. 1 minute, 2, 4, the status flicking to processing, and then, at the 7-minute mark, the stark green letters, approved for payment. The video wasn't finished. I had overlaid a final sequence. The screen split. On the left, the video of the approval continued to play. On the right, a map appeared, with the GPS coordinates of the IP address from which the invoice had been submitted. A pin dropped, landing squarely on the Daily Grind coffee shop. A photo of the cafe's exterior faded into view. The metadata doesn't lie, I said, my voice narrating the silent film. The honeypot invoice, submitted from an anonymous IP address, was approved by the fast-track exec rule in 7 minutes. That rule is hard-coded to a single vendor. The IP address of the real Peregrine invoices submitted over the past year geolocates to a cafe 3 blocks from the CFO's registered home address. I stopped the video, leaving the final frame, the map, the photo, the approved status, frozen on the giant screen. I turned to the general counsel. David Thorne, who had been watching the entire demonstration with a grim, focused intensity, straightened his tie. He nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the members of the audit committee before landing on Celine. His voice was devoid of emotion, a pure statement of legal fact. For the record, he announced to the room, my office received a formal request from the head of risk management 5 days ago. A comprehensive legal data hold was enacted on all records pertaining to Peregrine North LLC prior to this meeting. All the data you have seen is preserved, legally secured, and admissible. The words sucked the last bit of oxygen from Celine's defense. This wasn't an accusation. It was an indictment. The evidence was real, and it was untouchable. Robertson, the head of the audit committee, looked at his 2 colleagues. A silent, instantaneous conversation passed between them. He then turned his steely gaze on Celine. Ms. Whitlock, he said, his voice cold as a winter morning. Pursuant to the authority of this committee, your duties, system access, and all executive privileges as Chief Financial Officer are suspended, effective immediately. You will be placed on administrative leave pending the results of a full, independent forensic audit. The professional execution was complete. Now, the personal one began. My father, who had been watching the entire spectacle as if it were a play in a language he didn't understand, finally seemed to process the reality of the situation. The color drained from his face. He pushed his chair back and rose unsteadily to his feet, his hand gripping the edge of the table for support. He stared at his wife, his visionary CEO persona shattered, leaving only a confused, broken man. Celine, he whispered, his voice cracking. What is this? What have you done? She didn't look at him, her eyes, filled with a venomous, cornered hatred, were locked on me. She took a step towards my end of the table, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. "You," she hissed, her voice a low, menacing whisper that only I and those closest could hear. "You will regret this for the rest of your life." I didn't raise my voice. I met her glare, and for the first time, I let the memory of the garage, the sting on my cheek, the ache in my ribs, surface in my eyes. I leaned forward slightly and spoke just as quietly. My words meant only for her. "I've had enough regrets. Celine, starting with that night in the garage." Her face contorted, a flicker of understanding followed by a wave of pure fury. She looked like she was about to lunge. But it was Brenda from HR who spoke, her voice suddenly finding a new, firm register. She picked up the conference phone and pressed a pre-programmed button. "Security," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We require assistance in the main boardroom. Please escort Ms. Whitlock from the premises." A moment later, the heavy wooden door at the far end of the boardroom swung open. It didn't open with a bang. It didn't reveal heavily armed guards. It revealed two uniformed security officers, a man and a woman, their expressions neutral, their posture professional. They stood just inside the doorway, waiting. They were not there to cause a scene. They were simply there to close one. Their presence was not loud, but it was absolute. It was final. The security officers did not touch Celine. They simply stood, their presence a silent, immovable fact. After a long, shuddering moment, she seemed to deflate, the furious energy draining out of her, leaving behind something brittle and hollow. She picked up her portfolio, her movements stiff and robotic. She didn't look at my father. She didn't look at the board. She walked the long length of the table, her heels clicking a stark, lonely rhythm on the hardwood floor. As she passed me, her eyes met mine one last time. They held no fire, only a cold, bottomless emptiness. Then she was gone, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft, definitive click. The sound was a full stop. For a moment, the room remained in a state of suspended shock. The executives and directors looked at the empty chair, at my father's stricken face, at the damning evidence still frozen on the screen. The crisis was over, but the fallout was just beginning. I walked back to my seat, my own movements feeling deliberate and slow. I reached into the leather briefcase at my feet and took out a simple, plain manila folder. It contained no digital media, no encrypted files. It contained only paper. I stood, walked to the head of the table, and placed the folder gently in front of Mr. Robertson. "There's one more piece to this," I said, my voice even and quiet. "The motive. This wasn't just about greed. It was about suppression." Robertson opened the folder. The other two audit committee members leaned in to look. Inside was the complete file on the incident in the garage. They saw the doctor's report from urgent care, its clinical language describing the contusions. They saw the high-resolution, time-stamped photographs of the bruises on my face and ribs. They saw a printed copy of the incident report email I had sent to myself. And on top, they saw my original, handwritten note from that first night. "Begin. Phase 1. Documentation. Retaliation must be legal, procedural, and non-emotional." Robertson read the medical report, his expression hardening into granite. "This assault, it occurred the night you returned to Oakmere?" "Yes," I confirmed. The stated reason was that I should not interfere with her work or her systems. The physical intimidation was a direct result of my professional duties. When that failed, she moved to suppress my official HR complaint and discredit me. I looked at David Thorne. That is when I submitted the anonymous whistleblower report to this committee. The general counsel nodded, confirming the timeline. The committee received an anonymous report detailing the potential suppression of a workplace violence complaint, he stated for the official record. That report, combined with the subsequent dossier Ms. Hale provided detailing the financial irregularities, triggered the protections afforded to her under the Stratus Ledger Corporate Governance Charter and the Whistleblower Protection Act. I want to make it unequivocally clear to everyone in this room, Ms. Hale has acted as a protected whistleblower. Any action, direct or indirect, that could be construed as retaliatory against her will be met with the most severe legal consequences, both for the individuals involved and for the company. His words were a shield, locking my victory into place with the full force of corporate and federal law. With the legalities established, the boardroom shifted its focus to damage control. Robertson, now fully in command, began issuing directives. An interim CFO will be appointed by the end of the day from our senior finance team, a Big Four accounting firm, one with no prior relationship to this company, will be retained to conduct a complete, independent forensic audit of all financial systems, effective immediately. All transactions with the entity known as Peregrine North LLC are to be frozen and flagged for legal review. A carefully worded statement will be prepared for internal distribution to investors and key stakeholders, framing this as a proactive measure initiated by the board to strengthen internal controls. The corporate machine was already working, swiftly and impersonally, to excise the disease and close the wound. It was in the midst of this procedural storm that Brenda from HR approached me. Her face was ashen, her professional empathy replaced by a raw, undisguised fear. She had been complicit in the cover-up, and she knew it. "Marin," she said, her voice low, "your original complaint, ticket 734B, it has been fully reinstated in the system. I have been instructed by the General Counsel to engage an independent, third-party firm to investigate the initial incident and its subsequent handling by my department. You will have our full cooperation." It wasn't an apology, it was an act of capitulation, a desperate bid for self-preservation. I simply nodded. The energy in the room was suffocating. I needed air. I stood up and walked away from the table, toward the immense glass wall that overlooked the city. Down below, the cars moved like cells in a vast, circulatory system. The sky, which had been a uniform, oppressive gray when the meeting began, was starting to break. Shards of pale, watery sunlight were piercing through the cloud cover, illuminating patches of the city in a soft, hazy glow. The storm had passed. I heard footsteps behind me. It was my father. He stood beside me, his reflection a ghostly, diminished figure in the glass. He didn't look at the city. He looked at me. His face was a wreck of shame and dawning comprehension. The visionary CEO was gone, replaced by a man staring into the abyss of his own willful blindness. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Marin, why didn't you just come to me? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I didn't turn to face him. I kept my eyes on the brightening skyline. The anger I might have felt was gone, burned away by the cold fire of my focused campaign. All that was left was a quiet, sad clarity. "I did," I said. "The day I arrived, I asked you about vendor risk. I told you I was seeing things that were a liability. I spoke to you in the only language you seem to value, the language of the business." I finally turned to look at him, my gaze level and clear. "I spoke with data. Today is the first time you listened." The truth of it landed on him, a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes falling away from mine. He had no defense. He had chosen peace over truth, profit over protection. He had let the fox guard the henhouse because the fox was laying golden eggs. He stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the board meeting a distant murmur behind us. Then he looked up, his eyes shining with a profound, painful understanding. He looked at me not as a functionary, not as a risk manager, but as his daughter. "Welcome home, Marin," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I hadn't heard from him in 14 years. This time, the words weren't a hollow greeting in a cold airport terminal. They were a confession, an apology, an acknowledgement. I held his gaze, and I gave him a small, slow nod. There were no tears. The time for that had long passed. The fight had been won not in this room, with its shouting and revelations, but in the quiet, lonely hours of the nights before, in the garage, at my desk, in the meticulous, painstaking assembly of an unbreakable chain of evidence. Victory wasn't a cathartic scream. It was a procedure, correctly followed. I walked back to the lectern, the meeting now winding down around me. The demonstration was still frozen on the giant screen. I closed the program. The map and the approved status vanished, replaced by the benign Stratus Ledger logo. I reached down and pulled the USB drive from its port, the decoy that had been my only prop. I slipped it into my pocket. The show was over. The lights were still on, but the stage was now empty. I stepped out of the boardroom and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the sound absorbed by the thick, unnervingly plush carpet of the executive hallway. The immediate silence was a physical presence, a stark contrast to the implosion I had just witnessed. The air inside the room had been electric with shock and the frantic, quiet hum of damage control. Out here, the air was still, cold, and indifferent. I didn't rush. My footsteps made no sound as I walked the long corridor. It was a gallery of glass. Each office I passed a transparent box displaying an empty chair and a dormant computer screen. This high on the 28th floor, you were supposed to feel a sense of power, of elevation. Right now, it just felt empty, a stage after the actors had gone home. Halfway to the elevator bank, I passed the glass entrance to the main conference suite. Etched into the glass in elegant, silver letters was the company's credo, the words Celine had championed, the words I had seen on 100 posters and 1,000 login screens. Now, my own reflection was superimposed over them, a ghostly image in the polished surface. Integrity, accuracy, trust. The words no longer felt like a cynical joke. They weren't a lie to be mocked. They were a standard to be enforced, a weapon to be wielded. I had held the company to its own marketing, and it had broken the person who had defiled it. The reflection stared back, my expression unreadable. I felt no triumph, only the quiet, profound exhaustion of a long and necessary task finally completed. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The buzz was a sharp, tactile intrusion in the silent hallway. I pulled it out. The screen glowed, displaying 2 new email notifications. The first was from Robertson, the chairman of the audit committee. The subject line was clinical, direct. Special committee action. The body of the email was brief, stripped of all pleasantries, a pure instrument of corporate governance. Ms. Hale, pursuant to the committee's resolution, you are hereby directed to proceed with the special audit of all financial controls and vendor accounts related to the office of the CFO. Effective immediately, you are granted full and unrestricted access to all necessary data and personnel. A third-party forensic accounting firm will be engaged to support your work. Further instructions will follow. It was the formal order. The engine had been started. The wheels of consequence were now turning, powered by the very system Celine had thought she commanded. It was no longer my personal project. It was now a corporate mandate, an unstoppable, procedural cleansing. The second notification, stacked just below the first, was from the automated HR system. The subject, Update on Case 734B. This is an automated notification to inform you that your case has been fully reinstated and escalated for independent third-party investigation. As the reporting party, you are afforded all protections under the Stratus Ledger whistleblower policy. A case manager will be in contact with you within 24 hours. We are committed to a safe and respectful workplace. The message was boilerplate, generated by a machine, but it was the formal digital resurrection of a truth that had been buried. It was the closing of a circle that had begun with a punch in a dark garage. It was confirmation, not of my victory, but of my protection. The system, once turned against me, was now my shield. My thumb hovered over the screen. I navigated away from my inbox, opening my notes application. I scrolled down to a draft I had created that first night, sitting in my old childhood room. The sting on my cheek a burning reminder of my new reality. The title was simple: Resignation. The text below it was a single, bitter paragraph, a surrender I had prepared in case the fight became unwinnable. I had been ready to walk away, to cede the field. I looked at the words for a long moment. Then, I pressed the delete button. A confirmation box appeared. Delete this note? I tapped delete. The draft vanished without a trace, a ghost of a future that would now never happen. I put the phone back in my pocket. I stood there, alone in the vast, silent corridor. There was no applause echoing from the boardroom. No one rushed out to shake my hand or offer a congratulatory embrace. The silence was absolute. My victory was not a shared celebration. It was a private, solitary fact. I was aware of the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the faint scent of ionized air from the ventilation systems, and the sound of my own breathing. Slow, steady, even. The same breath I had counted in the garage to keep from screaming was now the rhythm of my composure. I pulled my phone out one last time. I didn't open my email. I opened a messaging app and sent a new message to the only contact in its history. Myself. It was the final entry in my incident log. The words were few, the culmination of my entire strategy. Not with a fist, with a record. I hit send. The message appeared with a small, blue checkmark beside it. Documented. Complete. I resumed my walk toward the elevator bank. The polished floor reflected the overhead lights, creating a long, receding tunnel of brightness. It felt like walking out of a sterile, quiet hospital after a long and difficult surgery. The sickness had been removed. The patient would survive, but the recovery would be long, and there would be scars. I reached the elevators and pressed the button. The small, circular light glowed amber. I heard the faint whir of the machinery as the car ascended to meet me. The sound was a promise of descent, of a return to the ground floor, to the real world. The bronze doors slid open with a soft, expensive sigh. I stepped inside. The space was small, paneled in the same dark mahogany as the boardroom table. The doors began to close, slicing the long, empty hallway into a shrinking sliver of light. In the polished bronze of the closing doors, I saw my reflection one last time, clearer now than it had been in the etched glass. My face was pale, my eyes were tired, but they were my own. The doors sealed shut, encasing me in silence. It was just me, the soft hum of the elevator, and a single, final thought, a phrase that now belonged entirely to me, reclaimed and redefined. Welcome home. The end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'm so grateful to have you here. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support what I do, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world to me.